The massive frame of Jake Sullivan stood silhouetted against the burning barn, his weathered hands gripping a Winchester rifle as flames licked at the October sky. At 6 feet 7 inches, he towered over the three armed men facing him across the farmyard, their faces twisted with greed and malice in the firelight. Behind Jake, a woman's weak coughing echoed from the small homestead cabin, each rasp a reminder of what was at stake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You picked the wrong family to threaten, Morrison. Jake's voice rumbled like distant thunder across the Colorado plains. His steel-gray eyes never wavered from the cattle baron's hired guns, each man armed and ready for violence. The lead gunman spat into the dirt, his hand hovering near his holster. "This ain't your fight, drifter. Walk away while you still can." Jake's massive shoulders straightened, the rifle steady in his calloused hands. "I reckon it became my fight the moment those children asked for my help." The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the promise of snow. "Their mama's dying, and you vultures want to pick clean what little they got left." "She's gonna die anyway," came the cold response. "Might as well make it profitable." The giant cowboy's jaw tightened, memories of his own lost family flickering behind his eyes like the flames consuming the barn. "Not while I'm still breathing." But this confrontation was 3 weeks in the making, born from a moment when desperation met compassion on the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, Colorado. 3 weeks earlier, the autumn wind cut through Cedar Falls like a blade, sending tumbleweeds dancing down the main street and rattling the weathered signs that hung from storefronts. The town had seen better days, that much was certain. What had once been a thriving silver mining community was now a collection of sun-bleached buildings clinging to existence in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Jake Sullivan had ridden into town at dawn, his massive black stallion Thunder picking its way carefully through the rutted streets. At 6 feet 7 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds of solid muscle, Jake was an imposing figure even without trying to be. His broad shoulders strained against a faded blue work shirt, and his worn leather vest bore the scars of a dozen fights and 1,000 miles of hard travel. A thick brown beard covered most of his weathered face, but couldn't hide the network of small scars that spoke of a violent past. His hands, large enough to palm a man's skull, rested gently on Thunder's reins with the practiced ease of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than most men spent walking. The giant cowboy wasn't looking for trouble when he came to Cedar Falls. Truth was, Jake Sullivan tried his best to avoid trouble these days. At 42 years old, he had seen enough violence and heartbreak to last several lifetimes. The war had taken his youth, and a house fire had taken his family. For the past 15 years, he had drifted from town to town, taking odd jobs and moving on before he could form attachments that might lead to more loss. His reputation as a man who helped folks in need had a way of following him, though, and that reputation had a habit of finding him even when he wasn't looking for it. Cedar Falls looked like the kind of place where a man could water his horse, buy supplies, and disappear again without anyone paying much attention. The morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the few people Jake could see moving about their business had the hunched, hurried look of folks who preferred to mind their own affairs. Perfect for a drifter who wanted to remain anonymous. Jake guided Thunder toward what appeared to be the town's only stable, a rickety structure that had seen better decades. The sign hanging crookedly over the entrance read, "Murphy's Livery," though the paint was so faded it was barely legible. As he approached, an elderly man with thinning gray hair and clothes that had been patched more times than they'd been washed emerged from the shadowy interior. "Morning, stranger," the old man called out, his voice carrying the kind of weariness that came from too many years of hard living. "Name's Pat Murphy. Need somewhere to stable that fine horse of yours?" Jake nodded, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who had been riding since childhood. Up close, his size was even more intimidating. The stable owner had to crane his neck to meet Jake's eyes, and there was a moment of uncertainty as Murphy took in the giant's appearance. The cowboy's clothes were travel-worn but clean, his boots were good quality leather despite their age, and the gun on his hip was well-maintained but worn with use rather than for show. "Jake Sullivan," the giant introduced himself, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested too many nights sleeping under the stars and too many days breathing trail dust. Looking to rest my horse and pick up some supplies. Don't plan on staying long. Murphy nodded, though there was something in his expression that suggested he had heard similar promises before. That'll be 50 cents for the day, Mr. Sullivan. Feed and water included. He paused, studying Jake's face with the shrewd eyes of a man who had learned to read people quickly. You wouldn't happen to be the Jake Sullivan folks talk about, would you? The one who helped those miners up in Leadville? Jake's expression hardened slightly. His reputation had a way of preceding him, and that wasn't always a good thing. Men with reputations tended to attract attention, and attention often led to expectations he wasn't sure he could meet anymore. Depends on what folks are saying. He replied carefully. Before Murphy could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main street. Voices were raised in argument, and Jake could hear the distinctive sound of someone being shoved roughly. His instincts, honed by years of military service and frontier living, immediately went on alert. Without thinking, he turned toward the disturbance, his hand instinctively moving closer to his sidearm. Please, Dr. Walsh, you have to come. Mama's burning up with fever, and she can't hardly breathe. The voice was young, desperate, and filled with the kind of terror that comes from watching someone you love slip away. Jake's eyes found the source of the commotion quickly enough. A boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old was tugging frantically at the sleeve of a well-dressed man in a black coat. The boy was thin, too thin, with clothes that had been mended so many times they were more patched than original fabric. His brown hair was tousled and dirty, and there were tear tracks through the grime on his face. Beside him stood a little girl, perhaps 8 years old, clutching a bundle that Jake realized with a start was a baby. The man the boy was pleading with was clearly the town doctor, though he looked like he had seen better days himself. Dr. Henry Walsh was probably in his 60s, with gray hair that stuck out at odd angles and clothes that bore the stains of his profession. More troubling were the telltale signs of a man who had been drinking heavily. His hands shook slightly, his eyes were bloodshot, and he swayed just a bit as he tried to pull away from the boy's desperate grip. I told you already, Tommy, the doctor said, his words slightly slurred. I can't do nothing more for your mama. She's got the consumption, and there ain't no cure for that. Best thing you can do is make her comfortable and prepare for the inevitable. The boy, Tommy, refused to let go. But she's getting worse. Dr. Walsh. She was coughing up blood this morning, and she can't even sit up anymore. There's got to be something you can do. Boy, I said there ain't nothing to be done. The doctor's voice rose, and he gave Tommy a rough shove that sent the child stumbling backward. Your mama's dying, and that's the end of it. Stop pestering me with things I can't fix. The little girl, still holding the baby, let out a small cry as her brother caught himself from falling. Her wide blue eyes were filled with tears, and the baby in her arms began to fuss and cry. The sight of these 3 children, clearly alone and desperate, hit Jake like a physical blow. For a moment, he was transported back 20 years to another time, another place, where he had been unable to save the people who mattered most to him. Dr. Walsh, please. Tommy tried again, his voice breaking. We ain't got nobody else. Papa's been dead 2 years, and Mama's all we got. If she dies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The doctor's response was to turn his back on the children entirely. I got other patients to see, he muttered, though Jake noticed he was heading in the direction of the Silver Dollar Saloon rather than toward any medical emergency. Find someone else to bother. Tommy's face crumpled as he watched the only medical help in town walk away from his family's crisis. The boy's shoulders shook with barely contained sobs, but he was clearly trying to be strong for his younger siblings. The little girl looked up at her big brother with complete trust, as if she believed he could somehow fix their terrible situation through sheer will alone. Jake felt something twist in his chest, a familiar pain that he had spent 15 years trying to forget. He had walked away from too many people who needed help, telling himself that it wasn't his business, that he couldn't save everyone, that getting involved would only lead to more heartbreak. But looking at these 3 children, alone and facing the loss of their mother, he found he couldn't take that first step away. Murphy, who had been watching the scene unfold, shook his head sadly. Those poor Mitchell kids, he said quietly. Their mama Sarah's been fighting the consumption for months now. Started after their daddy got killed and that mine collapsed too. Years back, Tom Mitchell was a good man, worked hard to provide for his family. Since he died, they've been barely scraping by on that little farm of theirs. Jake's eyes remained fixed on the children. Tommy had gathered his sister and the baby close to him, clearly trying to figure out what to do next. The boy's face showed a maturity far beyond his 12 years, the kind of premature adulthood that came from having to be the man of the family before you were even old enough to shave. What about the rest of the town? Jake asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. Nobody else willing to help. Murphy's expression grew even more grim. Most folks got their own troubles, Mr. Sullivan. Times have been hard since the silver mines played out. And then there's Morrison. Richard Morrison, owns the biggest cattle ranch in the valley, along with half the businesses in town. He's been buying up failed farms and homesteads for pennies on the dollar, sometimes not even bothering with the legal niceties. Word is, he's got his eye on the Mitchell place. Water rights, you see. Willow Creek runs right through their property, and Morrison needs that water for his cattle. Jake's jaw tightened as the implications became clear. So nobody wants to help the Mitchell family because they're afraid of crossing Morrison. That's about the size of it, Murphy confirmed. Morrison's got Sheriff Dawson in his pocket, along with most of the town council. Man's got a way of making life difficult for folks who don't see things his way. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake noticed a group of men emerging from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Even at a distance, it was clear these weren't ordinary cowboys or townspeople. They moved with the predatory confidence of hired guns, and their weapons were worn for quick access rather than show. At their head walked a man in an expensive black suit who could only be Morrison himself. Richard Morrison was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of lean, hard build that came from a lifetime of taking what he wanted by force. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his mustache was perfectly waxed. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power, from his tailored clothes to the gold watch chain that gleamed across his vest. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a man who saw other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. Morrison's gaze swept across the street and landed on the Mitchell children with unmistakable satisfaction. Jake could see the cattle baron say something to his men that made them chuckle, though the sound held no warmth or humor. It was the kind of laugh predators made when they spotted wounded prey. Tommy Mitchell must have noticed Morrison's attention as well, because he gathered his siblings closer and began backing toward the side street that presumably led toward their family's farm. The boys' movements were quick and furtive, like a rabbit trying to escape the notice of a circling hawk. But Morrison wasn't content to simply watch from a distance. He crossed the street with his men flanking him, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk with each step. The other people on the street seemed to meld away, finding sudden urgent business elsewhere rather than risk witnessing whatever was about to unfold. Well, Morrison said as he approached the children, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that was somehow more threatening than open hostility. If it isn't the Mitchell children, how's your mama doing, boy? Tommy's face went pale, but he straightened his shoulders and met Morrison's gaze directly. She's doing fine, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for asking. Morrison's smile was thin and sharp as a knife blade. Is she now? That's strange, because I heard tell she's been coughing up blood and can barely get out of bed. Consumption's a terrible thing, boy. Eats you up from the inside until there's nothing left but skin and bones. The little girl, Lucy, pressed closer to her brother, and the baby in her arms began to cry again. Tommy's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he was smart enough not to make any aggressive moves toward a man who could destroy his family with a word. We're managing just fine, Tommy said through gritted teeth. Don't need any help from nobody. Oh, but I think you do, Morrison replied, his tone becoming more openly predatory. See, I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I have a solution that could benefit everyone involved. Your mama's medical bills must be piling up, and that farm of yours isn't producing enough to keep a family of field mice alive, let alone 3 children and a dying woman. Jake could see exactly where this was headed, and he felt his anger building like steam in a boiler. Morrison was going to make an offer for the Mitchell farm, probably for a fraction of its worth, and he would present it as an act of charity rather than the land grab it really was. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for your family's property, Morrison continued, confirming Jake's suspicions. Enough money to pay for your mama's medical care and set you children up somewhere nice back east where you'd have proper supervision. The farm ain't for sale, Tommy said firmly, though Jake could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Papa always said that land was our future, and we ain't giving it up. Morrison's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his false smile. Your papa's dead, boy, and your mama's following him fast. You're going to need that money for a funeral soon enough, and then what? You think the three of you can work that farm by yourselves? You think the bank's going to let you keep making payments when there's no income coming in? We'll manage, Tommy repeated, but there was less conviction in his voice now. The boy was clearly beginning to realize just how desperate his family's situation really was. I'm sure you'd try, Morrison said with mock sympathy. But trying ain't the same as succeeding. Tell you what, boy, I'll give you a week to think about my offer. Talk it over with your mama while she's still able to understand what's being discussed. Because after she's gone, well, things are going to get a lot more complicated for you children. The threat was delivered with the same false pleasantness, but there was no mistaking its meaning. Morrison was giving the Mitchell family a choice between selling out voluntarily or being forced out after their mother died. Jake had heard enough. Every instinct told him to walk away, to mind his own business, to avoid getting entangled in a situation that could only end badly for everyone involved. He had learned the hard way that playing the hero usually led to heartbreak and loss. But as he looked at those three children, facing down a predator who would destroy their family, without a second thought, he found he couldn't take that first step toward his horse. Instead, Jake Sullivan began walking toward the confrontation, his massive frame cutting an imposing figure as he approached. Each step brought him closer to a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make, but found himself making anyway. Morrison's men noticed the giant cowboy's approach first, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons as they sized up this potential threat. Morrison himself turned to see what had caught his gunman's attention, and his eyes narrowed as he took in Jake's size and obvious competence. Something I can help you with, stranger? Morrison asked, his voice losing some of its false friendliness and taking on a harder edge. Jake stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. Up close, Morrison's men looked exactly like what they were, hired killers with cold eyes and quick hands. Jake counted 3 of them, all armed and alert, all sizing him up like wolves evaluating a potential rival. Couldn't help but overhear your conversation, Jake said, his voice calm and measured. Sounds like these children are going through a hard time. Family business, Morrison replied curtly. Nothing that concerns you. Jake's eyes moved to Tommy, who was staring up at the giant cowboy with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The boy clearly wanted help, but had learned not to expect it from adults who promised more than they could deliver. Boy looks like he could use a friend, Jake observed, still keeping his tone conversational despite the tension crackling in the air. Sometimes when folks are grieving and scared, they make decisions they might regret later. Morrison's expression darkened considerably. Are you suggesting I'm taking advantage of these children's situation? I'm suggesting, Jake replied, his voice growing slightly harder, that a week isn't much time for a boy to say goodbye to his mama and figure out how to take care of his family. Might be more Christian to give them some space to grieve proper before discussing business matters. The silence that followed was charged with potential violence. Morrison's men had spread out slightly, positioning themselves for a fight if one developed. Jake remained perfectly still, but every line of his body suggested coiled power ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. Finally, Morrison smiled, but there was nothing pleasant about the expression. You're new in town, so you don't understand how things work around here. But you seem like a reasonable man, so I'll explain it to you once. My business with the Mitchell family is just that, my business. I'd strongly advise you not to make it your business as well. Jake's gray eyes never wavered from Morrison's face. And if I do? Then you'll discover that Cedar Falls can be a very unfriendly place for strangers who don't know their place. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake was well aware that he was outnumbered and outgunned. and that Morrison clearly had the backing of local law enforcement. Getting involved in this situation could very well get him killed and would almost certainly bring trouble down on the very people he was trying to help. But as he looked down at Tommy Mitchell's upturned face, Jake saw something that decided the matter for him. In the boy's eyes was the same desperate hope he had seen in his own son's face 20 years ago, just before the fire took everything that mattered to him. He had failed his own family when they needed him most. Maybe he couldn't change that, but he could damn well try to save this one. Jake knelt down slowly, bringing his massive frame closer to Tommy's eye level. The boy didn't flinch, which impressed the giant cowboy more than he cared to admit. Most grown men took a step back when Jake Sullivan looked them in the eye, but this 12-year-old kid stood his ground like a seasoned soldier. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked gently, his voice carrying none of the edge it had held when addressing Morrison. "Tommy Mitchell," the boy replied, his chin jutting out with stubborn pride. "This here's my sister Lucy, and the baby's our brother David." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Our mama's real sick, mister. The doctor says she's got consumption and there ain't nothing to be done, but I don't believe that. There's got to be something." Jake's heart clenched at the desperation in the boy's voice. It was the same desperation he had felt 20 years ago when the doctor in Kansas had told him there was nothing to be done for his own wife and son after they had been pulled from the burning house. The same helpless rage that had driven him to drink and violence before he learned to bury those feelings deep enough that they couldn't destroy him completely. "Where's your farm?" Jake asked, standing back up to his full height. Morrison and his men were still watching from across the street, but they had backed off slightly after Jake's show of support for the children. "About 3 miles south of town, near Willow Creek," Tommy answered. "Why, mister? You ain't really gonna help us, are you? Most folks around here are too scared of Mr. Morrison to get involved." Jake looked down at the 3 children, taking in their worn clothes, their too thin faces, and the way they clung together against a world that seemed determined to crush them. Lucy was clutching baby David so tightly that the infant had stopped crying and was simply staring up at Jake with enormous blue eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. "I reckon I might take a ride out your way," Jake said finally. "Have a look at your mama. See what the situation is. Can't promise anything more than that." Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "You mean it, mister? You'll really come see mama?" Jake Sullivan, the giant, introduced himself properly. "And yes, I'll come see your mama. But first we need to get you children some food. When's the last time any of you had a proper meal?" The question seemed to embarrass Tommy, who looked down at his worn boots. "We had some cornbread yesterday morning. Mama made it before she got too weak to get out of bed." Jake's jaw tightened. These children hadn't eaten in over a day, and they were trying to take care of a dying woman and a baby. The situation was even worse than he had initially thought. "Come on," Jake said, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Let's get you fed before we do anything else. Can't think straight on an empty stomach." He guided the children toward the Silver Dollar Saloon, which seemed to be the only establishment in town that was still busy in the middle of the day. Morrison and his men watched them go, their expressions promising that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Silver Dollar was exactly what Jake had expected from a frontier saloon, with sawdust on the floor, a long bar lined with bottles of questionable whiskey, and tables where men played cards and discussed business in low voices. What surprised him was the woman behind the bar. Margaret O'Brien was perhaps 45 years old, with auburn hair streaked with gray and green eyes that missed nothing. She was wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency, but Jake could see the intelligence behind her gaze as she sized up the new arrivals. "Well now," Maggie said as Jake and the children approached the bar. "If it isn't the Mitchell children. Tommy, what are you doing bringing your sister and the baby into a place like this?" "It's all right, ma'am," Jake interjected before Tommy could answer. "I wanted to buy them some food. They haven't eaten in a while." Maggie's sharp eyes moved from Jake to the children and back again, clearly assessing the situation. "Food, is it? Well, I suppose I could rustle up some beef stew and fresh bread. Won't be fancy, but it'll fill their bellies." "Much obliged," Jake said, pulling out a silver dollar and placing it on the bar. "Whatever they can eat, and maybe some milk for the baby if you've got it." "I've got it," Maggie confirmed, but she didn't move to collect the money immediately. Instead, She studied Jake's face with the shrewd gaze of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. You wouldn't be the Jake Sullivan, would you? The one who helped those folks up in Leadville when the mine owners were trying to cheat them out of their wages? Jake sighed inwardly. His reputation really had preceded him to Cedar Falls, which meant Morrison probably already knew exactly who he was dealing with. Depends on what you heard, he replied carefully. Maggie smiled, and for the first time since arriving in town, Jake saw an expression that held genuine warmth. I heard you stood up to 6 armed men when they tried to intimidate a widow whose husband died in a cave-in. Heard you made sure she got every penny she was owed, plus compensation for her loss. Stories tend to grow in the telling, Jake said uncomfortably. He had never been comfortable with praise, especially when it came to his attempts to help people. Too often, his efforts led to more problems than they solved. Maybe, Maggie agreed, but the core of it's usually true. And if you're the man, I think you are, then Morrison's going to be very unhappy that you've taken an interest in the Mitchell family. She busied herself ladling thick beef stew into bowls while Tommy lifted Lucy onto a bar stool and tried to keep baby David from fussing. The little girl's eyes were wide as she took in the saloon's unfamiliar surroundings, but she seemed to understand that food was coming and waited patiently. Tell me about Morrison, Jake said quietly, positioning himself so the children couldn't hear the conversation. How long has he been the big man around here? Maggie's expression darkened as she set the bowls of stew on the bar along with thick slices of fresh bread. About 5 years now. Came in after the silver boom started going bust, buying up claims and homesteads for practically nothing. Started with the failed mines, then moved on to the farms and ranches that were struggling. Always legal, mind you, or at least legal enough that Sheriff Dawson doesn't see any problems with it. And the sheriff works for Morrison? Might as well. Dawson was elected fair and square, but Morrison's money pays his salary and his men's salaries too. The town can't afford proper law enforcement on tax revenue alone, so Morrison stepped in to help. Very generous of him. Jake watched Tommy help his sister with her stew, the boy eating slowly to make his portion last longer. It was clear the children were ravenous, but they had learned to make food stretch when they didn't know where the next meal was coming from. What about the Mitchell place specifically? Jake asked. Why is Morrison so interested in a small farm? Maggie glanced around to make sure no one else was listening before answering. Water rights. Willow Creek runs right through the Mitchell property, and it's the best source of fresh water in the valley. Morrison's got thousands of head of cattle, and he needs that water to expand his operation. The Mitchell's farm sits right at the narrowest point of the valley, where the creek comes down out of the mountains. Control that land, and you control the water. And without the water, Morrison's empire starts looking a lot less impressive. There are other ranchers in the area who'd love to see his operation fail, but they're too scared to move against him directly. If someone else controlled that water source, though, it might change the balance of power considerably. Jake absorbed this information while watching Tommy feed small spoonfuls of milk to baby David. The infant seemed healthier than his siblings, probably because he was still nursing from his mother, but even he was smaller than a baby his age should be. How bad off is Mrs. Mitchell? Jake asked. Really? Maggie's expression grew sad. Sarah's been fighting the consumption for months now. Started not long after her husband Tom was killed in that mine accident. Some folks say it's the grief that made her susceptible to the disease. Others think she caught it from one of the other miners' families. Either way, she's been getting worse despite Dr. Walsh's treatments. What kind of treatments? Mostly whiskey and laudanum for the pain. Walsh means well, I think, but he's been drinking heavier since his wife died 3 years ago. Not sure how much good he's doing anyone these days. Jake felt a familiar surge of anger at the injustice of it all. A good woman was dying. 3 children were facing starvation and homelessness, and the only people with the power to help were either too drunk to care or actively working to make the situation worse. There's something else you should know, Maggie continued, her voice dropping even lower. Morrison's been spreading rumors around town that the Mitchell place is cursed. Says that's why Tom died in the mine accident, why Sarah got sick, why their crops have been failing. It's nonsense, of course, but it's making folks even more reluctant to help the family. Cursed how? According to Morrison, the Mitchells built their house on an old Indian burial ground. Says the spirits are angry and anyone who helps the family will bring bad luck on themselves. Like I said, it's nonsense, but people around here are superstitious enough to take it seriously. Jake shook his head in disgust. Morrison wasn't content to simply intimidate people into abandoning the Mitchell family. He was actively working to isolate them by playing on fear and superstition. Tommy finished his stew and wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "Thank you kindly for the food, Mr. Sullivan. That's the best meal we've had in weeks." "You're welcome, son," Jake replied, then made a decision that he knew would complicate his life considerably. "Now, how about you show me the way to your farm? I'd like to meet your mama." The ride to the Mitchell homestead took about an hour, with Jake leading Thunder while Tommy rode the family's old mule and Lucy walked alongside carrying baby David. The path followed Willow Creek for most of the way, winding through stands of aspen and cottonwood that were just beginning to turn golden with the approaching winter. Jake could see immediately why Morrison wanted this land. The creek was clear and fast-running, fed by mountain snowmelt that would provide reliable water even during the driest years. The valley was sheltered from the worst winter storms, and the soil looked rich and fertile. In the right hands, this could be a prosperous farm or the foundation of a substantial ranching operation. The Mitchell homestead, when it came into view, told a different story. The house was small but solidly built, with a stone foundation and log walls that had been chinked against the weather. A vegetable garden showed signs of recent tending, though most of the plants had already been harvested or killed by early frost. A small barn and chicken coop completed the farm buildings, along with a corral that currently held only the mule Tommy had been riding. What struck Jake most forcefully was how quiet everything was. There were no cattle lowing, no pigs grunting, no chickens scratching in the yard. The only sounds were the creek running nearby and the wind rustling through the trees. It was the silence of a place where life was slowly draining away. "Mama's inside," Tommy said as they approached the house. "She's been sleeping most of the time lately, but she might be awake." Jake tied Thunder to a fence post and followed the children toward the front door. As they got closer, he could hear the sound that had been haunting Tommy's nightmares, a harsh, rattling cough that spoke of lungs filled with fluid and a body fighting a losing battle against disease. The interior of the house was clean but sparse, with handmade furniture that showed the wear of hard use and limited resources. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small fire burning that provided more light than heat. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living area, with a ladder leading to what was probably a sleeping loft for the children. In the corner, on a narrow bed that had been moved down from the bedroom for convenience, lay Sarah Mitchell. Jake had seen enough death during the war and in the years since to recognize its approach, and Mrs. Mitchell was clearly in the final stages of consumption. She was pale as winter moonlight, with dark circles under her eyes and cheeks that had once been full but were now hollow with illness and weight loss. Her breathing was labored and shallow, interrupted frequently by coughing fits that left flecks of blood on the cloth she held to her lips. Despite her condition, Sarah's eyes were alert and intelligent when they focused on Jake. She struggled to sit up as Tommy approached her bedside, clearly wanting to present herself as well as possible to this stranger who had brought her children home. "Mama, this is Mr. Jake Sullivan," Tommy said, his voice carefully controlled to hide his distress at seeing how much weaker his mother had become during their brief absence. "He bought us dinner in town and said he'd come see you." Sarah's gaze moved from her son to Jake, and the giant cowboy found himself looking into eyes that held the same fierce determination he had seen in Tommy's face. This was a woman who was fighting to stay alive not for her own sake, but for her children's. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying warmth and dignity. "Tommy told you about our situation?" "Some of it," Jake replied, removing his hat as he approached the bed. "I'm sorry to hear about your illness, ma'am, and sorry for the loss of your husband." Sarah's smile was weak but genuine. "Tom was a good man, worked hard to provide for his family. I just wish." She broke off as another coughing fit seized her, this one lasting longer than the others and leaving her gasping for breath. Jake waited patiently for the fit to pass, using the time to assess the situation more thoroughly. The house was clean and well-maintained despite the family's poverty, suggesting that Tommy had been doing his best to keep things together. There were signs of recent medical attention, including bottles of medicine on a small table beside the bed. But Jake suspected these were doing more to ease Sarah's pain than to actually treat her condition. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jake said gently, when her breathing had stabilized, "I'm not a doctor, but I've seen consumption before. Have you had any other medical opinions besides Dr. Walsh?" Sarah shook her head weakly. "Dr. Walsh is the only doctor in Cedar Falls, and we can't afford to bring someone in from Denver or Colorado Springs. Besides, Tommy told me what the doctor said. There's no cure for what I have." Jake's jaw tightened. While it was true that consumption was often fatal, especially in the later stages, there were treatments that could sometimes slow its progress or at least make the patient more comfortable. Dr. Walsh's approach of whiskey and laudanum was the medical equivalent of giving up. "What about other healers?" Jake asked. "Sometimes folks who aren't formally trained doctors have knowledge that can help. There's a Mexican woman, Elena Vasquez, who lives about 10 miles south of here," Sarah replied. "People say she knows about herbs and such, but Dr. Walsh warned me against seeing her. Says she's a witch who uses devil magic." Jake snorted in disgust. In his experience, doctors who warned against folk healers were usually more concerned about protecting their territory than their patients' welfare. Some of the most effective medical treatment he had ever received had come from people who learned their skills from experience rather than medical school. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jake said, making another decision that would further complicate his situation. "If you're willing, I'd like to bring Elena Vasquez here to take a look at you. Can't hurt to get another opinion, and folk healers sometimes know things that regular doctors don't." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You do that? But you don't even know us." And Dr. Walsh said, "Dr. Walsh ain't the one lying in that bed," Jake interrupted gently. "And from what I've seen of his recent medical practice, I'm not inclined to put much stock in his opinions." Tommy had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. "You really think this Elena woman might be able to help Mama?" "I don't know," Jake replied honestly, "but I think she's worth talking to. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones, especially when the new ways aren't working at all." Sarah struggled to push herself up higher in the bed, and Jake quickly moved to help her, placing a gentle hand behind her back to support her. Even through her nightgown, he could feel how thin she had become, her shoulder blades sharp beneath his palm. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice gaining strength from hope, "why are you helping us? Tommy said you just rode into town today. You don't owe us anything." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the creek running clear and cold in the afternoon sunlight. How could he explain to this dying woman that her children's situation reminded him of his own failures, his own losses? How could he tell her that helping them might be the only way he could live with himself? "Sometimes a man finds himself in a place where he can make a difference," he said finally. "And sometimes making that difference is the only thing that makes sense in a world that seems bent on being senseless." Sarah studied his face with the penetrating gaze of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and settled back against her pillow. "Tommy," she said, "show Mr. Sullivan where we keep the spare blankets. If he's going to help us, he'll need a place to sleep." "Mama, I can't stay here," Jake protested. "Morrison's already unhappy about my interest in your family. If I start living here, it'll make things worse for all of you." Sarah's laugh was weak but held genuine humor. "Mr. Sullivan, things can't get much worse for us than they already are. I'm dying, my children are facing starvation, and Morrison's circling like a vulture waiting for me to breathe my last so he can steal our land. If you staying here makes him angry, well, at least he'll be angry at someone who can fight back." Tommy was nodding vigorously. "Please stay, Mr. Sullivan. We ain't had a man around the place since Papa died, and there's work that needs doing before winter sets in proper." Jake looked around the small house, taking in the worn furniture, the careful patches in the walls. Where chinking had been replaced, the small pile of firewood that wouldn't last a week once the real cold set in. These people needed help with a lot more than just Sarah's medical condition. "All right," he said finally. "I'll stay for a few days. But we need to understand each other. I'm not looking to become part of your family permanent. Once we get your mama some proper medical attention and take care of the immediate problems, I'll be moving on." Tommy's face fell slightly, but he nodded understanding. "Yes, sir. We understand. But as Jake looked at the 3 children clustered around their mother's bedside, he wondered if he really understood what he was getting himself into. In his experience, there was no such thing as helping people just a little bit. Once you started caring about someone's welfare, it became harder and harder to walk away. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming to the Colorado mountains, and the Mitchell family was in no condition to survive it alone. Whether Jake Sullivan was ready or not, he was about to become their protector, their provider, and quite possibly their last hope. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of approaching horses reached them from outside. Jake moved quickly to the window and peered through the glass, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. 3 riders were approaching the house, and even at a distance, he could see they weren't paying a social call. "Tommy," Jake said quietly, "take your sister and the baby into the back room. Stay there until I tell you it's safe to come out." "What's wrong?" Tommy asked, but he was already moving to obey, gathering Lucy and baby David with the quick efficiency of someone who had learned to recognize danger. "Company," Jake replied grimly, checking his weapon. "The kind that doesn't knock before they come calling." Sarah struggled to sit up again, alarm evident in her eyes. "Is it Morrison's men?" "Appears to be," Jake confirmed. "Don't worry, Mrs. Mitchell. I'll handle this." But as he stepped outside to face whatever was coming, Jake couldn't help but wonder if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Morrison had warned him that Cedar Falls could be unfriendly to strangers who didn't know their place. Now it looked like the cattle baron was ready to make good on that threat. The 3 riders who approached the Mitchell homestead moved with the deliberate confidence of men accustomed to intimidating others through their mere presence. Jake recognized the type immediately from his years of frontier living, hired muscle, with just enough authority to be dangerous and just enough stupidity to be unpredictable. They wore their guns low on their hips in the manner of men who believed quick draw made up for poor aim, and their horses bore the expensive tack that marked them as employees of someone with considerable wealth. The leader was a lean man with a scraggly beard and cold eyes that held the flat, emotionless gaze of a professional killer. His companions flanked him on either side, their hands resting casually near their weapons as they surveyed the homestead with obvious contempt. These weren't men who had come to deliver a message or engage in conversation. They had come to send a warning, and warnings from Morrison's crew typically involve pain. Jake stepped out onto the porch, his massive frame filling the doorway as he faced the approaching riders. At 6 feet 7 inches and nearly 300 pounds, he cut an imposing figure even when he wasn't trying to be threatening. Now, with his hand resting on his gun and his gray eyes hard as winter steel, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had survived 2 decades of violence and wasn't particularly concerned about surviving another fight. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Jake called out as the riders pulled up about 20 feet from the porch. "Something I can help you with?" The leader spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt before answering. "Name's Wade Kowalski. I work for Mr. Morrison. He sent us out here to check on the Mitchell family, make sure they're doing all right." "That's mighty thoughtful of him," Jake replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm sure Mrs. Mitchell appreciates his concern for her welfare." Kowalski's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake's face and build. "You must be the drifter who caused trouble in town this morning. Sullivan, isn't it?" "Jake Sullivan. And I don't recall causing any trouble. Just bought some hungry children a meal and had a conversation with their neighbor." "Mr. Morrison, don't consider that conversation neighborly." One of the other riders spoke up, a younger man with nervous energy and the kind of quick movements that suggested he was eager to prove himself. "He thinks maybe you got the wrong idea about his business with the Mitchell family." Jake's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a slight edge when he responded. "And what idea would that be?" Kowalski held up a hand to silence. His companion before the young hothead could say something stupid. The leader was clearly more experienced than his associates, and he had correctly identified Jake as someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated by bluster and threats. "Mr. Morrison wants to make sure you understand the situation here," Kowalski said carefully. "The Mitchell family's in a bad way, what with Mrs. Mitchell being sick and all. Mr. Morrison's made them a generous offer for their property, enough to take care of their medical bills and set the children up proper. He's concerned that outside interference might confuse the family about what's in their best interests." "I see," Jake said quietly. and he sent 3 armed men to express this concern because he's worried I might not understand his generous intentions. The third rider, a heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks and scars on his knuckles that suggested he preferred his fists to his gun, shifted in his saddle and grinned unpleasantly. Mr. Morrison knows you got a reputation for sticking your nose where it don't belong. He wants to make sure you understand that this time, it might get cut off. Jake's jaw tightened at the direct threat, but he kept his voice level. I appreciate Mr. Morrison's concern for my welfare. You can tell him I said so. We can do that, Kowalski agreed. But we got another message to deliver too. Mr. Morrison's heard some disturbing rumors about the Mitchell place. Folks are saying it might be cursed, what with all the bad luck that's fallen on the family. He's worried that anyone who spends too much time here might find that bad luck rubbing off on them. The threat was delivered with the same false concern Morrison had used in town, but Jake could hear the steel underneath the pleasant words. Morrison was escalating the conflict, moving from subtle intimidation to direct warnings. The next step would likely involve actual violence. Curses are funny things, Jake replied thoughtfully. In my experience, the people who spread tales about curses are usually the ones causing the bad luck in the first place. Kowalski's pleasant expression slipped slightly, revealing the predator underneath. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Of course, some folks might take that kind of talk personal. Some folks might, Jake agreed. But I've found that bullies don't like being called out for what they are, even when everyone already knows the truth. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. The 3 riders shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons as they reassessed the giant cowboy standing before them. Jake remained perfectly still, but every line of his body radiated controlled power. He had the look of a man who had been in more fights than he could count and wasn't particularly worried about adding one more to the tally. The young rider's nerves finally got the better of him. Maybe we should just shoot him now and be done with it, he said, his voice cracking slightly with tension. Mr. Morrison said to deliver a message. Kowalski cut him off sharply. We've delivered it. His eyes never left Jake's face as he continued. But if the message isn't received properly, we might have to come back with a different approach. I hear you loud and clear, Jake said. Now, unless you boys are planning to water your horses or accept some hospitality, I suggest you ride back to Morrison and tell him his message was received and understood. Kowalski nodded slowly, but his expression promised that this conversation was far from over. We'll do that. But Sullivan, you might want to think real careful about your next moves. This valley's got room for folks who know their place, but it can be real unfriendly to those who don't. With that parting threat, the 3 riders turned their horses and rode back toward town, kicking up dust clouds that lingered in the still air long after they had disappeared from view. Jake remained on the porch until he was certain they were gone, then stepped back inside to find Tommy peering around the corner of the back room, his young face tight with worry. Are they gone? The boy asked quietly. For now, Jake replied. But they'll be back unless we give them a reason not to come. Sarah had managed to prop herself up in bed despite her weakness, and her eyes held the fierce protectiveness of a mother wolf defending her cubs. Mr. Sullivan, I won't have you getting hurt because of us. Maybe it would be better if you left before things get worse. Jake shook his head firmly. Mrs. Mitchell, those men didn't come here because I'm staying at your place. They came because Morrison wants your land and he's tired of waiting for you to die or give up. My being here might have accelerated his timeline, but it didn't create the problem. But now he'll come after you too, Tommy said, his voice small and frightened. And we can't protect you any more than we can protect ourselves. Son, Jake said gently, I've been taking care of myself for a long time now. Morrison's boys might think they're tough, but they're bullies who are used to scaring folks who can't fight back. That's not me. Lucy had emerged from the back room as well, still clutching baby David, and she looked up at Jake with enormous blue eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 8 years. Are you going to stay and help us anyway? She asked in a small voice. Even though the bad men don't want you to? Jake knelt down to her level, his massive frame folding with surprising grace. Yes, little one, I'm going to stay and help, but we need to be smart about how we do it. He turned back to Sarah, his expression serious. Mrs. Mitchell, I meant what I said about bringing Elena Vasquez to see you. But first, we need to make this place more secure. Morrison's going to escalate this conflict, and when he does, we need to be ready. What do you mean? Tommy asked, though Jake could see the boy was already thinking ahead, trying to figure out how they could defend themselves against men with guns and horses. And no scruples about using violence. I mean, we need to turn this homestead into a place that's too costly for Morrison to take by force. We need supplies, weapons, and allies. Most importantly, we need to make sure the people of Cedar Falls understand what's really happening here. Sarah coughed weakly, but her voice was firm when she spoke. Mr. Sullivan, most of the people in town are too scared of Morrison to get involved. Those who aren't scared are already in his pocket. Maybe, Jake agreed. But I found that sometimes people just need someone to take the first stand before they find their own courage. Morrison's power depends on everyone believing he's too strong to fight. Once that illusion gets cracked, it tends to crumble pretty quickly. Tommy's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. You really think we can beat him? I think we can make it so expensive for him to keep pushing that he decides to look for easier targets. Jake replied honestly. Morrison's a businessman first and a bully second. If fighting us costs him more than our land is worth, he'll find another way to get what he needs. And if he doesn't? Sarah asked quietly. Jake's expression hardened. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand something. I've spent most of my adult life running from fights, telling myself it wasn't my business, that I couldn't save everyone. But looking at your children, seeing what Morrison's trying to do to your family, I realize I'm tired of running. He stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing in his mind like ice forming on a winter pond. Morrison thinks he can take whatever he wants because nobody's strong enough to stop him. It's time someone proved him wrong. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass and a thin skin of ice on the water trough outside the barn. Jake had spent a restless night in the barn, partly to give the family privacy and partly to keep watch for any sign of Morrison's men returning under cover of darkness. He had learned during the war that the hours just before dawn were the most dangerous, when sentries were tired and attackers could use the growing light to their advantage. But the night had passed without incident, and Jake emerged from the barn to find Tommy already up and working, feeding their few remaining chickens, and checking the vegetable garden for anything that might have survived the recent frost. The boy moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing adult work for far too long, and Jake felt a familiar pang of sympathy for childhood lost to necessity. Morning, Tommy. Jake called softly, not wanting to wake the rest of the family if they were still sleeping. Morning, Mr. Sullivan, Tommy replied, looking up from the chicken coop with a smile that seemed forced. Mama had a bad night. Couldn't stop coughing, and she brought up more blood than usual. Jake's jaw tightened. Sarah Mitchell's condition was deteriorating rapidly, which meant they had even less time than he had hoped to find her proper medical care. How's she doing this morning? A little better, I think. Lucy's with her now, and the baby slept through the night for once. Tommy straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. Mr. Sullivan, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about making this place too costly for Morrison to take. What about it? Well, I know this land better than anyone except maybe Papa did before he died. I know where all the good defensive positions are, where the water sources are, how to get from here to town without using the main road. If we're really going to fight, that might be useful. Jake studied the boy's face, seeing determination mixed with fear and a desperate desire to protect his family. Tommy Mitchell was 12 years old and trying to be the man of the house in a situation that would challenge a seasoned adult. The kid had more courage than most grown men Jake had known. It would be very useful, Jake agreed. But Tommy, I need you to understand something. If we decide to make a real fight of this, it's going to be dangerous for everyone involved. Morrison's not going to just give up and walk away. I understand, Tommy said quietly. But Mr. Sullivan, what choice do we have? If we don't fight, Morrison gets our land anyway. At least this way, maybe we've got a chance. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them again. But this time, there was only one rider, and as the figure came into view, Jake could see it was a woman riding side saddle on a small mare. She was perhaps 55 years old, with graying black hair braided down her back and clothes that marked her as someone who worked with her hands for a living. That's Elena Vasquez, Tommy said with excitement. The woman you wanted to see, Mama. Jake felt a surge of relief. Somehow, word had reached the Mexican healer about Sarah's condition, and she had come of her own accord. That suggested either that news traveled faster in this valley than he had expected, or that Elena had her own sources of information about who needed help. Elena rode up to the house with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to go. She was a handsome woman with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of steady presence that made people trust her instinctively. Her horse was well cared for despite its modest appearance, and her saddlebags appeared to be packed with supplies. Buenos dias, she called out as she dismounted. I am Elena Vasquez. I heard there is a woman here who is very sick. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied, stepping forward to help her tie her horse to the fence post. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. She has consumption, and the town doctor hasn't been able to help her much. Elena's expression grew serious. Dr. Walsh is a good man, but he drinks too much since his wife died, and he learned his medicine in a different time. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. She gathered her saddlebags and turned toward the house, then paused to study Jake's face with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. You are the one they call the giant cowboy, see? The one who helps people in trouble? Jake Sullivan, he introduced himself. And I try to help when I can. Elena nodded approvingly. Morrison's men came to my place yesterday evening. They warned me not to come here, said the Mitchell family is cursed, and anyone who helps them will share their bad luck. Jake felt his anger rising. Morrison wasn't content to threaten the people already helping the Mitchell family. He was actively working to prevent them from getting any assistance at all. And yet you came anyway, he observed. Elena's smile held both warmth and steel. Mr. Sullivan, I have been helping people for 30 years. I have delivered babies, treated fevers, set broken bones, and eased the passing of those who could not be saved. Morrison's threats do not frighten me, and his curses do not concern me. When a woman is dying and children are suffering, that is where I belong. Tommy had been listening to this exchange with growing hope, and now he stepped forward. Eagerly. Mrs. Vasquez, can you really help our mama? Dr. Walsh says there's nothing more to be done. Elena's expression softened as she looked down at the boy. Niño, I cannot promise miracles, but I have knowledge of herbs and treatments that might ease your mother's suffering and perhaps slow the disease's progress. Sometimes that is enough to give the body time to heal itself. She headed toward the front door, then paused and looked back at Jake. Mr. Sullivan, I should warn you. My coming here will anger Morrison even more. He does not like it when people ignore his warnings. Let me worry about Morrison, Jake replied grimly. You just focus on helping Mrs. Mitchell. As Elena disappeared into the house, Tommy looked up at Jake with something approaching hero worship in his young eyes. You really think she can help Mama? I think she's going to try her best, Jake said honestly. And sometimes that's all anyone can do. But as he watched Elena enter the house where Sarah Mitchell lay dying, Jake knew that helping the family was only part of the battle they were facing. Morrison had made it clear that he would not tolerate interference with his plans, and the cattle baron had the resources to make good on his threats. If they were going to save the Mitchell family, they would need more than medical knowledge and good intentions. They would need allies, weapons, and a plan for dealing with a man who viewed other people's lives as obstacles to be removed. The war for the Mitchell homestead was about to begin in earnest, and Jake Sullivan found himself wondering if his conscience had finally led him into a fight he couldn't win. Elena Vasquez emerged from the Mitchell house 2 hours later, her face grave but not without hope. Jake had been pacing the yard like a caged bear, checking and rechecking his weapons while keeping one eye on the horizon for any sign of Morrison's men returning. Tommy sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood with nervous energy, while Lucy played quietly with baby David in a patch of morning sunlight. How is she? Jake asked immediately, reading the complex emotions in Elena's dark eyes. The disease is advanced, Elena said honestly, settling her medical supplies back into her saddlebags. But it has not yet reached her lungs completely. There is still healthy tissue, still a chance for healing if we can stop the progression. Tommy jumped up from the steps, hope blazing in his young face. You can cure her? Elena held up a cautionary hand. Niño, I cannot promise a cure, but I have herbs that can help clear the fluid from her lungs, strengthen her body's ability to fight the infection. Most importantly, I have knowledge of treatments that might slow the disease. Enough for her body to overcome it naturally. She reached into her bag and withdrew several small cloth packets, each tied with string and labeled in careful Spanish script. These must be prepared as teas 3 times daily. This one, she held up a packet of dried leaves, is for the coughing. This reduces fever and inflammation. And this, she displayed a collection of roots and bark, helps the body build strength to fight infection. Jake examined the packets with interest. During his years of wandering, he had encountered folk healers throughout the West, and he had learned to respect their knowledge. Often, they knew things about the human body and its ailments that formally trained doctors had forgotten or never learned. What else does she need? He asked. Rest, good food, clean air, and hope, Elena replied simply. The disease feeds on despair as much as it does on weakness. If Sarah believes she can recover, her body will fight harder. And if Morrison's men come back while she's trying to heal, Elena's expression hardened. Then we must make sure they do not succeed in whatever they are planning. Stress and fear will undo any progress the medicines might achieve. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses reached them from the direction of town. But this time, it was a larger group, and they were coming fast. Jake counted at least 6 riders, all moving with the purposeful urgency of men on a mission. Get inside, Jake ordered Tommy and Lucy. Take the baby and stay with your mother. Elena, you should go too. The Mexican healer shook her head firmly. I have dealt with men like Morrison before, Mr. Sullivan. Sometimes a woman's presence makes them think twice about violence. Jake wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The riders were already visible through the trees, and he could see they were heavily armed. Morrison had apparently decided that subtle threats weren't sufficient to deal with the situation. The group that thundered into the Mitchell yard was led by Morrison himself, mounted on a magnificent black stallion that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. The cattle baron was dressed in his usual expensive black suit, but now he wore a gun belt as well, and his face held the cold determination of a man who had decided to settle matters permanently. Behind him rode Wade Kowalski and the 2 men from the previous day, along with 3 additional gunmen that Jake didn't recognize. They spread out in a semicircle around the house, effectively surrounding anyone who might try to escape. These weren't men who had come to deliver another warning. They had come to end the problem once and for all. Sullivan, Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the yard with unmistakable authority. Time for you to saddle up and ride out. This is your last chance to leave peacefully. Jake stepped off the porch and walked toward the mounted men, his massive frame moving with deceptive ease. At 6 feet 7 inches, he was tall enough that even mounted men had to look down only slightly to meet his eyes, and his presence seemed to fill the space between them. Morrison, he replied calmly. Seems like you brought a lot of friends for a social call. I brought enough men to handle any trouble that might arise, Morrison said coldly. You've had time to think about our conversation yesterday. I trust you've reached the right conclusion. Depends on what you consider right, Jake said. If you mean have I decided to let you steal a dying woman's land and leave 3 children homeless, then no, I haven't reached that conclusion. Morrison's face darkened. I'm not stealing anything. I made Mrs. Mitchell a fair offer for property she can't maintain. What happens to the children after she's gone is not my concern. Maybe it should be. Elena spoke up from beside Jake, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience. A man who would take advantage of orphaned children has lost his soul, no matter how much money he has. Morrison's cold gaze shifted to the Mexican healer, and his expression grew even more hostile. I warned you to stay away from here, woman. This family is cursed, and anyone who helps them will share their fate. Elena laughed, a sound that held no fear and considerable contempt. The only curse on this family is your greed, Morrison, and the only fate I fear is the one that awaits men who prey on the helpless. Enough talk, one of Morrison's gunmen said, his hand moving toward his weapon. Boss, let us finish this. We can make it look like they resisted arrest. On what charge? Jake asked mildly, though his own hand was now resting on his gun butt. Harboring a wanted fugitive, Morrison replied smoothly. I have it on good authority that Jake Sullivan is wanted for murder in Kansas. It was a lie, of course, but a clever one. Even if the local sheriff investigated, it would take weeks to verify or disprove the claim, and by then Morrison would have accomplished his goals. Meanwhile, the accusation gave his men legal cover for whatever violence they chose to inflict. That's interesting, Jake said thoughtfully, considering I've never been to Kansas in my life. Court will sort that out, Morrison said, after you're arrested and transported back to stand trial. The threat was clear. Morrison intended to either kill Jake outright or have him taken away where he couldn't interfere with the cattle baron's plans for the Mitchell family. Either way, Sarah and her children would be left defenseless. Mr. Morrison, a new voice called from the direction of town. I think you might want to reconsider your current course of action. Everyone turned to see a small group of riders approaching from the east. At their head rode Pastor William Hayes, the local preacher, flanked by several men Jake recognized from town. Behind them came Maggie O'Brien, riding astride like a man and carrying a rifle across her saddle. Morrison's expression shifted from confidence to irritation as he recognized the newcomers. Pastor Hayes, this is not church business. I suggest you turn around and go back to town. On the contrary, Pastor Hayes replied as his group spread out to flank Morrison's men. Protecting the innocent from those who would harm them is exactly church business. And from what I can see, you've brought enough armed men to start a small war. Maggie O'Brien guided her horse closer to Jake, her green eyes sparkling with combative energy. Thought you might could use some backup, she said quietly. Word's gotten around town about what Morrison's planning. How many people know? Jake asked. Enough, she replied. Turns out folks aren't as scared of Morrison as he thought. They were just waiting for someone to take the first stand. Pastor Hayes addressed Morrison directly, his voice carrying the moral authority of his position. Richard, what you're doing here is wrong, and you know it. Sarah Mitchell is a dying woman with 3 young children. Taking their land while she's fighting for her life is beneath even you. I'm offering to buy their property at a fair price, Morrison insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. If they choose not to sell, that's their decision. After you've threatened anyone who might help them, Elena added sharply. After you've spread lies about curses and tried to isolate them from any support. That is not offering, that is coercion. Tommy Mitchell appeared on the porch, his young face set with determination that reminded Jake painfully of his own son at that age. Mr. Morrison, my mama says to tell you that our land is not for sale at any price. She says my papa died working this ground, and she'll die before she lets you steal it from his children. Morrison's mask of civilized behavior finally slipped completely, revealing the predator underneath. Your mama's going to die anyway, boy. The question is whether she dies peacefully in her bed or watching her house burn down around her. The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that several of the townspeople gasped audibly. Even some of Morrison's own men looked uncomfortable with their boss's open admission of his intentions. That's enough, Jake said quietly, but his voice carried across the yard like thunder. Morrison, you've just threatened to murder a sick woman and 3 children in front of witnesses. I'd say that makes you the wanted man here. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but he found himself facing not just Jake Sullivan, but a dozen armed townspeople who had finally found the courage to stand up to his bullying. The cattle baron's advantage in numbers had evaporated, and his legal justifications had crumbled in the face of his own threats. This isn't over, Morrison snarled, but he was already signaling his men to withdraw. I own half this valley, and I'll have the other half one way or another. Maybe, Pastor Hayes said calmly, but not today and not this way. As Morrison and his gunman rode away, their retreat watched by a crowd of determined townspeople, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a battle won through courage rather than violence. The cattle baron's power had depended on fear and isolation, and when those weapons were taken away from him, he had proven to be just another bully who folded when faced with real opposition. Is it really over? Tommy asked, his voice small and hopeful. The immediate threat is, Jake replied honestly. But Morrison's not going to give up his plans just because we stood up to him once. He'll try a different approach, maybe work through the courts or find some other way to pressure your family. Maggie O'Brien dismounted and approached the group, her expression thoughtful. Maybe, but it won't be as easy for him now. Half the town just saw him threaten to burn down a dying woman's house. That's not the kind of thing people forget, even if they were scared of him before. Pastor Hayes nodded agreement. Richard Morrison has ruled this valley through intimidation for too long. Today, people remembered that his power depends on their fear. Without that fear, he's just another man with more money than conscience. Elena had been listening to this exchange while keeping one eye on the house, where Sarah Mitchell lay fighting for her life. The immediate danger may be past, she said quietly, but Sarah still needs time to heal. And winter is coming. This family will need help to survive the cold months, even if Morrison leaves them alone. Jake looked around at the faces of the townspeople who had ridden out to support the Mitchell family. These were ordinary folks, shopkeepers, farmers, laborers, who had found the courage to stand up to a powerful man when it mattered most. They had proven that good people could triumph over evil when they worked together, but the victory would be meaningless if Sarah Mitchell died anyway or her children suffered through the winter. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said, "your saloon serves as a kind of community center, doesn't it? People gather there to discuss business and news?" "That's right," Maggie replied, curious about where his thoughts were leading. "What would you say to organizing some kind of assistance for the Mitchell family? Food, firewood, maybe some help with the farm work? Sarah's going to need months to recover, assuming Elena's treatments work and the children can't handle everything alone." Maggie's face lit up with understanding. "A community effort. I like it. And it would send Morrison a message that the Mitchell family isn't alone anymore." Pastor Hayes was nodding enthusiastically. "The church has been looking for a way to help the Mitchells without seeming to take sides in the dispute with Morrison. If the whole community gets involved, it becomes a charitable effort rather than a political statement." Over the following weeks, the plan took shape with remarkable speed and efficiency. Maggie O'Brien organized a schedule of families who would bring meals to the Mitchell house, ensuring that Sarah didn't have to worry about cooking while she recovered. Pastor Hayes arranged for men from the congregation to help with farm work, repairing the barn, chopping firewood, and preparing the property for winter. Elena visited daily, monitoring Sarah's progress and adjusting her herbal treatments as needed. The Mexican healer's medicines proved remarkably effective. Within a week, Sarah's coughing had decreased significantly, and she was able to sit up for longer periods. Color began to return to her pale cheeks, and for the first time in months, she spoke of the future with something approaching hope. Jake found himself becoming a permanent fixture at the Mitchell homestead, though his role evolved from protector to general manager of the community assistance effort. His reputation and presence served to deter any thoughts Morrison might have had about renewed harassment, while his organizational skills helped coordinate the various forms of aid the family was receiving. Tommy Mitchell flourished under the attention and support of so many adults who genuinely cared about his family's welfare. The boy's premature seriousness began to give way to moments of actual childhood, and Jake often found him playing with other children who came with their parents to help with farm work. Lucy had overcome her initial shyness and now chattered constantly with the women who brought food and helped with household chores. Baby David grew visibly stronger on a diet, supplemented by fresh milk and vegetables from various community gardens. But it was Sarah's recovery that proved most remarkable. Elena's herbal treatments, combined with proper nutrition, rest, and the reduction of stress that came from knowing her children were safe and supported, worked what seemed like a miracle. By the end of October, she was able to walk around the house without assistance, and her coughing had decreased to occasional fits that no longer brought up blood. "I don't understand it," Dr. Walsh admitted during one of his infrequent visits to check on his patient. "By all medical knowledge, she should be getting worse, not better. Consumption in this advanced stage usually." He trailed off, unwilling to voice his original prognosis in front of the children. Elena smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the body knows how to heal itself if we give it the right support. Your medical books tell you what usually happens, but they do not account for the power of hope and community." Morrison, meanwhile, had not given up his designs on the Mitchell property, but his approach had become more subtle and legally complex. He filed papers claiming that Tom Mitchell had never properly registered his water rights, and therefore the creek running through the property should revert to public use, meaning Morrison's cattle would have access regardless of who owned the land. He also began spreading rumors that the recent community support for the Mitchell family was actually a plot by outside agitators to undermine the valley's established economic structure. Some of the more conservative townspeople began to worry that they had involved themselves in something larger and more dangerous than simple charity. Jake watched these developments with growing concern. Morrison was playing a longer game now, using legal challenges and social pressure instead of direct intimidation. It was a smarter approach that would be much harder to counter with community solidarity alone. The crisis came to a head in early November when Sheriff Pete Dawson arrived at the Mitchell homestead with legal papers ordering the family to appear in court to defend their water rights. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and failure to appear would result in automatic forfeiture of their claim to Willow Creek. "This is Morrison's doing," Jake said grimly as he read through the legal documents. "He's found a judge who's willing to hear his case, probably one who owes him favors or money." Sarah, who had been sitting up in her bed reading to Lucy, looked pale but determined. "Then we'll go to court and fight his claim. Tom registered those water rights properly when we first settled here. I have the papers to prove it." "Do you?" Jake asked, hope flickering in his chest. Sarah nodded toward a wooden chest in the corner of the room. "All of Tom's papers are in there. He was very careful about legal matters, said he'd seen too many good people lose their land because they didn't have proper documentation." Jake opened the chest and found a collection of carefully preserved documents, including the original deed to the property and a separate filing for water rights that appeared to be properly notarized and recorded. If these papers were legitimate, Morrison's legal challenge should fail. But as Jake studied the documents more closely, his heart sank. The water rights filing was dated after Tom Mitchell's death, and the signature, while close, didn't match other examples of Tom's handwriting that Jake could see in letters and farm records. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said gently, "I think these water rights papers might be forgeries. The date is wrong, and the signature doesn't look right." Sarah's face went white as she realized the implications. Without valid water rights, Morrison could claim access to Willow Creek for his cattle, effectively making the Mitchell farm worthless. Even if they kept the land, they wouldn't be able to farm it or raise livestock without reliable access to water. Tommy had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm. But Papa always said he filed the papers properly. He was real, careful about that kind of thing. "I'm sure he was," Jake replied. "But sometimes papers get lost or destroyed, and sometimes people take advantage of that to create false documents. Morrison's probably been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to challenge your family's claims." The realization that they had been outmaneuvered despite their community's support and Sarah's improving health hit the family like a physical blow. All their hope and progress seemed suddenly meaningless in the face of legal technicalities and forged documents. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake stood up slowly, his massive frame seeming to fill the small room as he made a decision that surprised even himself. "We go to court and we fight. And if the law won't protect you, then we'll find another way." "What do you mean?" Tommy asked. Jake's expression was grim but determined. "I mean that sometimes doing what's right matters more than what's legal. And sometimes a man has to be willing to risk everything to protect the people who matter most." The court hearing took place the following Thursday in Cedar Falls Small Courthouse, a wooden building that normally served as the town hall and occasional meeting place for various civic organizations. Judge Harold Pemberton had been brought in from the county seat specifically to hear Morrison's water rights challenge, a fact that immediately raised suspicions about the cattle baron's influence over the proceedings. Judge Pemberton was a thin, nervous man in his 60s with the look of someone who had spent his career avoiding difficult decisions whenever possible. His eyes darted constantly between Morrison and the Mitchell family, clearly uncomfortable with the political implications of the case he was being asked to decide. Morrison had brought 2 lawyers from Denver, expensive men in tailored suits, who spoke in legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. They presented their case with professional efficiency, arguing that Tom Mitchell had never properly filed for water rights, and therefore his family had no legal claim to exclusive use of Willow Creek. Sarah Mitchell, still weak from her illness, but determined to fight for her family's future, presented the documents they had found in Tom's chest. The forgery was immediately obvious to anyone who examined the papers closely, but Morrison's lawyers argued that the handwriting discrepancies could be explained by illness or age affecting Tom's signature. Jake watched the proceedings with growing anger, realizing that Morrison had essentially bought himself a legal victory regardless of the facts. Judge Pemberton was clearly reluctant to rule against such a wealthy and influential man, especially when the opposing party was a poor widow with 3 young children. When the judge announced that he would rule in favor of Morrison's water rights claim, effective immediately, Jake stood up slowly from his seat in the back of the courtroom. His massive presence seemed to fill the space, and conversations died, as people turned to see what the giant cowboy might do. "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "I'd like to present some additional evidence in this case." Judge Pemberton looked nervous. "Mr. Sullivan, this hearing is concluded. I've made my ruling." "Maybe so," Jake replied, "but I think the people of this community have a right to know what kind of justice they're getting from their courts." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Pastor Hayes, who was sitting in the front row. "Pastor, would you mind reading this to the court?" Pastor Hayes unfolded the paper, and his eyes widened as he read the contents. This appears to be a letter from Morrison to Judge Pemberton, discussing payment for services rendered and promising additional compensation for future cooperation. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications became clear. Morrison had been bribing the judge to ensure favorable rulings, turning the legal system into another tool for his land-grabbing schemes. "That's a forgery," Morrison shouted, jumping to his feet. "I've never seen that document before in my life." "Maybe," Jake said calmly, "but it sure looks like your handwriting to me. Of course, I'm not an expert. Maybe we should get a proper investigation, have some federal authorities come in, and take a look at how justice gets dispensed in Cedar Falls." Judge Pemberton's face had gone ashen, and he was backing toward the door with the desperate look of a man who knew his career was over. Morrison's lawyers were gathering their papers with obvious haste, clearly wanting to distance themselves from their client as quickly as possible. Morrison himself stood in the center of the chaos like a man watching his empire crumble around him. His face was purple with rage, and his hand kept moving toward his gun, but he was surrounded by dozens of townspeople who were no longer afraid of his threats. "This isn't over," he snarled at Jake. "You think you've won something here, but you've just made an enemy you can't imagine." "I reckon I can imagine just fine," Jake replied quietly. "And Morrison, if you come after this family again, you'll discover just how much trouble one angry cowboy can cause." That night, as the family celebrated their unexpected legal victory, Sarah Mitchell pulled Jake aside for a private conversation. She had regained much of her strength over the past weeks, and her eyes held the clear intelligence that had attracted Tom Mitchell when they first met. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, "I know that letter you produced today was a fake. Morrison may be corrupt, but he's not stupid enough to put bribery in writing." Jake's expression didn't change. "What makes you think it was fake?" Sarah smiled. "Because I've seen your handwriting on the grocery list you've been making, and it's very good. Good enough to copy someone else's style if you studied it long enough." Jake was quiet for a long moment, neither confirming nor denying her suspicions. "Sometimes doing what's right requires bending the rules a little," he said finally. "Morrison was willing to use forged documents to steal your land. I figured turnabout was fair play. And if you get caught, then I get caught. But your children will still have their home, and you'll still have your water rights." Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the man behind the reputation. "Why are you really doing this, Jake? Don't tell me it's just because you wanted to help strangers. There's something more personal driving you." Jake looked out the window at the creek running clear and cold under the November stars. 20 years ago, I had a family of my own. Wife and a son about Tommy's age. I was away fighting in the war when our house caught fire. By the time I got home, they were both dead, and I spent years blaming myself for not being there to protect them." He turned back to Sarah, his gray eyes holding depths of pain that no amount of time had been able to heal. "I can't save my own family, but maybe I can save yours. Maybe that's enough to balance the scales a little." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "Jake, what happened to your family wasn't your fault. You were serving your country, doing your duty." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "But duties. A cold comfort when the people you love are gone. At least this time, I can make sure that doesn't happen again." The final confrontation came, as Jake had known it would, on a cold December morning when snow was falling in thick flakes that muffled sound and reduced visibility to a few yards. Morrison had spent the weeks since the court hearing gathering a new crew of gunmen, men who were harder and more professional than his previous employees. Jake had been expecting the attack for days, reading the signs and the way people looked at him when he came to town. The nervous energy that seemed to permeate Cedar Falls like the scent of an approaching storm. Morrison had been humiliated in front of the entire community, and men like him didn't forgive that kind of embarrassment. The assault began just before dawn, when most of the family would normally still be asleep. But Jake had been keeping watch from the barn, and he spotted the attackers while they were still positioning themselves around the property. There were at least 8 men, all armed with rifles, moving with the professional competence of experienced killers. Jake made his way quickly to the house, waking the family and getting them into the root cellar that Tommy had shown him weeks earlier. The underground space was cramped but secure, with only one entrance that could be easily defended. "Stay down here no matter what happens," he told Sarah as he settled her and the children into the hidden space. "If something happens to me, wait until full daylight, then make your way to Pastor Hayes's house." "Jake, don't do this," Sarah pleaded. "There are too many of them. We can find another way." Jake's smile was grim but determined. "Mrs. Mitchell, sometimes a man has to make a stand, regardless of the odds. Your children deserve a chance to grow up free, and that's worth fighting for." Tommy grabbed Jake's arm as the giant cowboy prepared to leave. "Mr. Sullivan, you promised you'd stay and help us. Don't go getting yourself killed." "I'm keeping my promise, son," Jake replied gently. "This is how I help you." He sealed the root cellar entrance and made his way back outside, where Morrison's men were already closing in on the house. Jake positioned himself in the barn, where he had good sight lines across the yard and multiple escape routes if the situation became untenable. The first shots came as the sun was rising, sending the family's few remaining chickens squawking into the air and splintering wood from the barn walls. Jake returned fire carefully, making each shot count as he had learned during his military service. His first bullet took down one of the attackers, a clean shot that dropped the man instantly. The gunfight that followed was brief but vicious, with Morrison's men trying to use their superior numbers to overwhelm Jake's defensive position. But the giant cowboy had chosen his ground well, and his skill with weapons more than compensated for being outnumbered. When the shooting stopped, 3 of Morrison's men were dead and 2 more were wounded seriously enough to be out of the fight. The survivors had retreated to regroup, leaving Jake in control of the immediate area around the house. But as Jake reloaded his weapons and checked his ammunition supply, he knew the respite was temporary. Morrison would bring more men, and eventually, sheer numbers would overcome even the best defensive position. The sound of approaching horses made him prepare for another assault, but this time the riders were coming from the direction of town, and Jake could see they were flying a white flag of truce. Pastor Hayes rode at the head of a delegation that included Maggie O'Brien, Elena Vasquez, and several other townspeople. "Jake," Pastor Hayes called out as they approached. "Hold your fire. We've got news." Jake emerged from the barn cautiously, keeping his rifle ready but not aimed at the approaching group. "What kind of news?" "Morrison's dead," Maggie announced, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and relief. "Shot down in the street about an hour ago by a federal marshal who'd been tracking him for fraud and cattle rustling." Jake felt something that might have been disappointment that he wouldn't get to finish the fight personally, mixed with overwhelming relief that the threat to the Mitchell family was finally over. "Federal marshal? Turns out Morrison's been wanted for months," Pastor Hayes explained. "The authorities have been building a case against him for stealing cattle and land throughout Colorado and Wyoming. That stunt with the forged letter in court was the last evidence they needed to move against him." Elena Vasquez smiled knowingly. Sometimes the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn. Morrison's crimes finally caught up with him. As Jake helped the Mitchell family emerge from their hiding place, he realized that his part in their story was coming to an end. Sarah was healthy again, the children were safe, and the community had proven it would stand together against bullies and corruption. The family no longer needed a protector, and Jake Sullivan could return to his wandering life with the knowledge that he had finally managed to save the people who mattered most. But as he watched Tommy and Lucy playing in the snow while baby David slept peacefully in his mother's arms, Jake found himself reluctant to saddle up Thunder and ride away. For the first time in 20 years, he had found a place where he felt truly needed, truly at home. "You know," Sarah said quietly, approaching him as he stood watching her children play. "We're going to need help running this farm properly. Someone with experience, someone the children trust and respect." Jake looked down at her, seeing the invitation in her eyes and feeling something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not sure I'm the settling down type. I've been a drifter for a long time." "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But you're also a man who keeps his promises. And you promised my children you'd help them. That's a lifetime job if you're willing to take it." Jake Sullivan looked out over the Mitchell homestead, with its cleared fields and running water, its small house that had become a symbol of ordinary people's triumph over evil. He thought about his years of wandering, his attempts to outrun the guilt and grief that had driven him since the war. Maybe it was time to stop running and start building something positive instead. "Well," he said finally, "I reckon I could stay on for a while. Help with the spring planting, maybe teach Tommy some things about farming and life. If you think the community wouldn't mind having a giant cowboy as a permanent resident." Sarah's smile was brighter than the winter sun reflecting off fresh snow. "Mr. Sullivan, I think the community would be honored to have you stay. And I think my children would be heartbroken if you left." As if to prove her point, Tommy came running through the snow, his face glowing with excitement and happiness. "Mr. Sullivan, Mama says Morrison's really dead and we don't have to worry about him anymore. Does that mean you'll stay and help us run the farm?" Jake knelt down to the boy's level, seeing in Tommy's eyes the same trust and affection he had once hoped to see in his own son's face. "I think that means exactly that, son. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to help you and your family build something good here." Lucy joined them, still carrying baby David, and wrapped her small arms around Jake's massive neck. "We love you, Mr. Sullivan," she said simply. "Please don't go away." Jake Sullivan, the giant cowboy who had spent 20 years drifting from town to town, helping strangers and then moving on before he could form lasting attachments, found himself finally ready to put down roots. The Mitchell family had asked for his help when their mother was dying, and he had given them everything he had to give. In return, they had given him something he had thought lost forever: a home, a purpose, and a family to protect and love. As snow continued to fall over the Colorado Valley, blanketing the land in pristine white that promised renewal and new beginnings, Jake Sullivan stood surrounded by the people who had become his family. The giant cowboy who had started the day as a protector had become something even more important: a father, a provider, and a man who had finally found his place in the world. Morrison was dead, the threats were over, and the future stretched ahead full of possibilities. For the first time in 20 years, Jake Sullivan was home. The war for the Mitchell homestead began not with gunfire, but with winter's first serious blizzard. Jake Sullivan stood at the frosted window of the small farmhouse, watching snow pile against the barn walls while wind howled through the valley like a living thing bent on destruction. Inside, the warmth from the stone fireplace barely reached the corners of the main room, and he could see his breath when he moved away from the hearth. Elena Vasquez had worked her quiet miracles over the past month, and Sarah Mitchell's recovery had progressed beyond anyone's wildest hopes. The Mexican healer's combination of traditional herbs and careful nursing had cleared Sarah's lungs significantly, and while she still tired easily, the constant coughing had subsided to occasional fits that no longer brought up blood. More importantly, color had returned to her pale cheeks, and she had begun talking about spring planting and the future with genuine optimism. But winter was testing the family's resilience in new ways. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, and their carefully stockpiled supplies were running lower than Jake liked. The community support that had sustained them through the autumn was temporarily cut off by roads made impassable by drifting snow, and the few remaining cattle huddled in the barn were consuming hay faster than Jake had anticipated. Tommy Mitchell had grown several inches during the months since Jake's arrival, and his shoulders had broadened with the constant farm work. At 13 now, he moved with the confident competence of someone who had learned to handle adult responsibilities without losing his essential boyhood optimism. He sat near the fire, carefully cleaning Jake's spare rifle, while Lucy played quietly with baby David on a blanket nearby. "How much food do we have left?" Sarah asked from her rocking chair, where she was mending clothes by lamplight. Her voice was stronger than it had been in months. But Jake could hear the underlying worry that came from knowing how precarious their situation remained. Enough for maybe 2 weeks if we're careful, Jake replied honestly. He had learned that Sarah Mitchell appreciated straight talk more than false reassurance. The chickens are still laying some, and we've got salt pork and dried beans. We'll make it through. And if the storm doesn't break soon? Jake's jaw tightened slightly. If the storm continued much longer, they would face the choice between rationing food to dangerous levels or attempting to reach town through conditions that could easily kill them all. Neither option appealed to him, but he had survived worse situations during his years of wandering. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, he said simply. For now, we stay warm, stay fed, and wait for better weather. A sudden hammering at the front door cut through their conversation, the urgent pounding barely audible over the wind's constant howling. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he motioned for the family to stay back. Visitors during a blizzard usually meant trouble, and the desperate quality of the knocking suggested someone in serious distress. Jake opened the door cautiously, keeping his weapon ready, and found himself facing a figure so covered in snow and ice that it took a moment to recognize Pastor William Hayes. The preacher was barely conscious, his lips blue with cold and his entire body shaking with violent tremors that spoke of advanced hypothermia. Pastor Hayes, Jake exclaimed, immediately pulling the frozen man inside and slamming the door against the storm. Tommy, get more wood on the fire. Sarah, we need hot coffee and blankets. The family moved with practiced efficiency, each taking on tasks without being told. Tommy built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, while Sarah put coffee on to boil and Lucy gathered every spare blanket in the house. Jake helped Pastor Hayes out of his ice-covered coat and boots, noting with concern how white and cold the man's fingers had become. What were you doing out in this storm? Jake asked as he rubbed feeling back into the preacher's hands. You could have died trying to reach us. Pastor Hayes's teeth chattered so violently he could barely speak coherently. Had to warn you, he managed between chattering. Morrison, not finished, planning something. Jake felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the winter storm settle in his stomach. They had all hoped that Morrison's humiliation in court and the community's united opposition had ended his interest in the Mitchell property, but Jake had never fully believed the cattle baron would simply accept defeat. What kind of planning? Jake asked, wrapping Pastor Hayes in warm blankets while Sarah brought steaming coffee. The preacher accepted the coffee gratefully, holding the cup with shaking hands as feeling gradually returned to his extremities. One of Morrison's men came to the church yesterday, drunk and bragging, said Morrison's hired professional. Killers from Denver, planning to wait until the storm breaks, then finish this permanently. Tommy looked up from where he was tending the fire, his young face tight with worry. Professional killers? What does that mean? Jake's expression was grim as he processed this information. Morrison had apparently decided that subtle intimidation and legal maneuvering weren't sufficient to achieve his goals. If he was bringing in hired gunmen from outside the valley, it meant he was prepared to escalate the conflict to levels that would horrify the local community. It means Morrison's done playing games, Jake said quietly. He's decided to solve his problem with violence, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but her voice was steady when she spoke. How many men is he bringing? Pastor Hayes sipped his coffee slowly, still fighting the effects of his exposure to the cold. The drunk man said at least 6, maybe more. Professionals who've done this kind of work before. Morrison's paying them enough to ensure they won't have moral qualms about killing a woman and children. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. Morrison wasn't just threatening to steal their land anymore. He was planning to murder the entire family to eliminate any future challenges to his claim. The community support that had protected them before would be useless against professional killers who operated outside the boundaries of civilized behavior. We have to leave, Sarah said quietly, her maternal instincts overriding any attachment to the property. Pack what we can carry and head for Denver or Colorado Springs. Start over somewhere Morrison can't reach us. Jake shook his head firmly. In this storm? With a baby and you still recovering from consumption? We wouldn't make it 5 miles before the cold killed us all. Then what do we do? Tommy asked, his voice cracking slightly with stress. If we stay, Morrison's killers will come for Us. If we leave, the storm will get us. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire while his mind raced through possibilities. He had faced worse odds during the war, but never with innocent civilians depending on his decisions. Every choice carried terrible risks, and failure would mean the death of people he had come to love as his own family. "We make a stand," he said finally. "Turn this place into a fortress and make Morrison's killers pay such a high price for attacking us that they decide the money isn't worth dying for." Pastor Hayes looked skeptical. "Jake, these aren't local bullies or ranch hands. These are men who kill for a living. They won't be scared off by a show of resistance." "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But they're also businessmen who value their own lives above Morrison's money. If we can convince them that taking this job will get them killed, they might decide to find easier targets." Sarah studied Jake's face in the firelight, seeing the determination that had carried him through 2 decades of frontier violence. "What would we need to do?" Jake moved to the window and peered out through the frost-covered glass, assessing the defensive possibilities of the homestead. The house was solidly built with thick log walls that would stop most rifle bullets, and its position near the creek provided access to water even during a siege. The barn offered additional defensive positions, and the root cellar could serve as a final refuge if the main building became untenable. "First, we need to stockpile everything we might need for an extended fight," he said, turning back to the family. "Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies. If Morrison's men try to starve us out, we need to be able to outlast them." Tommy was nodding eagerly, his young mind already working through the logistics. "I know where Papa hid extra ammunition for his hunting rifle, and there's a cache of tools in the barn that we could use as weapons if we had to." "Good thinking," Jake approved. "We'll also need to prepare defensive positions, places where we can fight from cover while making it costly for attackers to advance on the house." Pastor Hayes finished his coffee and set the cup aside, his color gradually returning as the warmth penetrated his chilled body. "Jake, I should get back to town as soon as the storm breaks. Organize some kind of help." "No," Jake said firmly. "Morrison's probably watching for exactly that kind of response. If word gets back to him that we know about his plans, he might move faster than we expect. Better to let him think we're unprepared." "Then what about the community? The people who helped us before?" Jake's expression was troubled. "This is different, Pastor. Before, we were asking ordinary folks to stand up to a local bully. Now we're talking about facing professional killers who won't hesitate to murder anyone who gets in their way. I can't ask families with children to risk that kind of danger." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on Jake's arm. "So you're planning to face 6 or more professional gunmen by yourself?" "If that's what it takes," Jake replied simply. "I've made my choice to protect this family. I won't change my mind now just because the odds have gotten worse." Tommy stood up from the fire, his young face set with determination that reminded Jake painfully of his own son. "You won't be alone, Mr. Sullivan. This is our fight too." "Son, you're 13 years old," Jake protested. "You don't belong in a gunfight with professional killers." "Maybe not," Tommy agreed. "But I belong here defending my family's home. And I'm a pretty good shot with Papa's rifle." Jake looked around the room at the faces staring back at him, seeing courage and determination in each one. Sarah, still fragile from her long illness, but ready to fight for her children's future. Tommy, young but mature beyond his years and skilled with weapons. Even little Lucy seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, holding baby David protectively while watching the adults plan their defense. "All right," Jake said finally. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. Tommy, show me where your father's ammunition is hidden. Sarah, make a list of every bit of food we have and figure out how to ration it for at least 2 weeks. Pastor Hayes, once you're warmed up enough, help me check the defensive positions around the property." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. The blizzard continued to rage outside, providing cover for their activities while trapping them with their own fears and anticipation. Jake and Tommy worked together to reinforce the house's defenses, boarding up windows and creating firing positions that would allow them to defend multiple approaches simultaneously. Sarah, despite her recent illness, threw herself into the preparations with fierce determination. She organized their supplies with military precision, creating cache points throughout the house where food, water, and ammunition could be accessed even if part of the building was overrun. She also prepared medical supplies, knowing that treating wounded defenders might become her primary contribution to the battle. Pastor Hayes proved surprisingly knowledgeable about defensive tactics, revealing that he had served as a chaplain during the Indian Wars before taking up permanent residence in Cedar Falls. His experience with frontier warfare helped Jake plan overlapping fields of fire and escape routes that could allow them to retreat to stronger positions if necessary. Elena Vasquez arrived on the fourth day, appearing out of the thinning storm like a figure from a dream. The Mexican healer rode her sturdy mare through snow drifts that would have stopped most travelers, her face set with determination and her saddlebags bulging with supplies. "I heard from my nephew in town," she explained as she stamped snow from her boots. "Morrison's men arrived yesterday. 6 of them, all armed with new rifles and enough ammunition for a small war. They're waiting at the hotel for the weather to clear completely before making their move." Jake felt his stomach tighten. The waiting was almost over, and soon they would discover whether their preparations were sufficient to survive what was coming. "How much time do we have?" he asked. Elena assessed the weather with the practiced eye of someone who had spent her entire life reading natural signs. "The storm will break tonight or tomorrow morning. After that, maybe 6 hours before the roads are passable enough for armed men on horseback." Jake nodded grimly. Less than a day to complete their preparations and steel themselves for a battle. That would determine whether the Mitchell family lived or died. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option he was willing to consider. The storm broke just after midnight, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine white snow that reflected moonlight like scattered diamonds. Jake stood, watch at the main window, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement while the family slept fitfully in the reinforced back room. The silence was profound after days of howling wind, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timber and the distant howl of a coyote. Dawn brought clear skies and the sound Jake had been dreading. Horses moving through snow, their breathing visible in the frigid air as riders approached the homestead with careful deliberation. Jake counted 6 men, just as Elena had warned, all mounted on quality horses and armed with rifles that gleamed with fresh oil and maintenance. "They're coming," Jake called softly to the family, who immediately took their assigned positions without panic or confusion. Their days of preparation had created a smooth system of response that would have impressed a military unit. Sarah moved to the kitchen window with the old shotgun, while Tommy took position at the side window with his father's hunting rifle. Pastor Hayes positioned himself in the loft with Jake's spare weapon, and Elena remained in the back room with Lucy and baby David, ready to provide medical assistance or serve as a final line of defense if the house was breached. Jake himself took the main front window, his Winchester rifle loaded and ready, additional ammunition arranged for quick access. As the riders drew closer, he could see they were everything Elena had described, hard-faced professionals who moved with the confident competence of men accustomed to violence. The leader was a lean man with cold eyes and expensive equipment that marked him as successful in his deadly profession. He raised his hand to halt the group about 50 yards from the house, well within rifle range but positioned to minimize their exposure to defensive fire. "Sullivan," the leader called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "My name is Clayton Murdoch. I believe you know why we're here." Jake remained silent, studying the positioning of the attackers and calculating angles of fire. These men were clearly experienced, spreading out to cover multiple approaches and eliminate the possibility of a single defender taking out more than one of them with carefully placed shots. "Mr. Morrison has authorized me to make you a final offer," Murdoch continued. "Surrender the property peacefully, and you and the family can ride away unharmed. Refuse, and we'll take it anyway, but there won't be any survivors to complain about our methods." "Counteroffer," Jake called back, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Turn around and ride back to Morrison. Tell him the Mitchell family isn't giving up their home to a land-grabbing coward who hires other men to do his killing." Murdoch's laugh was cold and professional. "I was hoping you'd say that, Sullivan. Makes the job more interesting when there's a real fight involved." The gunfight began without further warning, Murdoch's men opening fire simultaneously in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume of bullets. Jake had anticipated this tactic, and his family was ready for it, keeping low behind their reinforced positions while return fire began immediately. Jake's first shot took down one of Murdoch's men with a clean hit to the chest, the professional killer toppling from his horse to lie motionless in the snow. Tommy's rifle barked from the side window, and another attacker cried out as the boy's bullet found its mark in the man's shoulder, sending him reeling in his saddle. The battle that followed was brief but vicious, with both sides using every advantage of position and skill they possessed. Murdoch's men tried to use their mobility to flank the house, but Jake had anticipated this, and his defensive positions covered all approaches effectively. When the shooting stopped, 3 of Morrison's hired killers were dead or wounded seriously, enough to be out of the fight. The survivors had retreated to regroup, leaving Jake's family in control of the immediate area around the house, but facing the certainty that more attacks would follow. "Is everyone all right?" Jake called out, quickly checking on his defenders. "We're fine," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Tommy got grazed on the arm, but it's not serious." Jake felt a surge of pride at how well his makeshift family had performed under fire. They had faced professional killers and held their ground, proving that courage and preparation could overcome superior numbers when the cause was right. But as he reloaded his rifle and prepared for the next assault, Jake knew the real test was yet to come. Murdoch would not underestimate them again, and the surviving killers would adapt their tactics to account for the defenders' competence. The second attack came from an unexpected direction. Instead of a frontal assault, Murdoch's surviving men attempted to burn them out, using flaming arrows to set fire to the barn and create enough smoke and confusion to cover their advance on the house. Jake had prepared for this possibility as well, stockpiling snow and water for firefighting. But the blazing barn created exactly the kind of chaos Murdoch had intended. Thick smoke billowed across the yard, reducing visibility and making it difficult to track the attackers' movements. "Stay calm," Jake called to his family as the smoke began seeping into the house. "Stick to the plan and watch your assigned areas. They're trying to confuse us, but we know this ground better than they do." The final confrontation came as the barn fire reached its peak, flames licking toward the house, while smoke created a hellish landscape of shifting shadows and uncertain visibility. Murdoch himself led the assault, moving with the deadly competence that had made him Morrison's choice for this job. Jake met him in the yard between the burning barn and the house, the 2 men facing each other in a scene that seemed lifted from some ancient legend of good versus evil. Both were skilled gunfighters. Both had survived countless battles, but only one was fighting for something more important than money. The shots came simultaneously, muzzle flashes bright in the smoky air. Murdoch's bullet grazed Jake's ribs, while the giant cowboy shot found its target in the killer's heart. Murdoch fell backward into the snow, his expensive weapons useless in the face of a father's determination to protect his family. The surviving members of Morrison's crew, seeing their leader dead and their mission failed, chose discretion over continued fighting. They gathered their wounded and rode away, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen comrades and the clear message that the Mitchell homestead was too costly a target for professional killers. As Jake stood in the yard watching them retreat, surrounded by the aftermath of battle and the smoldering ruins of the barn, he felt something shift inside him. The years of guilt and wandering, the constant search for redemption through helping strangers, suddenly seemed less important than the simple fact that he had finally found a place where he belonged. Tommy emerged from the house, his young face flushed with excitement and pride at having stood with the adults in defending their home. "Did we win, Mr. Sullivan? Are they really gone for good?" Jake looked down at the boy who had become like a son to him, seeing strength and courage that would serve him well in the years to come. "We won this fight, son. As for whether they'll be back, that depends on Morrison and how badly he wants this land." But as word of the failed attack spread through Cedar Falls and the surrounding valley, it became clear that Morrison's power had been broken permanently. The cattle baron's willingness to hire killers to murder a woman and children had horrified even his former supporters, and federal authorities were beginning to investigate his other activities with renewed interest. Within a month, Morrison himself had fled Colorado rather than face charges for conspiracy to commit murder, leaving behind an empire built on intimidation and corruption. His abandoned properties were seized by territorial authorities and redistributed to legitimate settlers, ensuring that his kind of influence would not return to the valley. Sarah Mitchell's recovery continued steadily through the winter, aided by Elena's ongoing treatments and the reduced stress that came from knowing her family was finally safe. By spring, she was strong enough to resume full management of the household, though she found that Jake Sullivan had become such an integral part of their lives that his departure was unthinkable. Tommy grew into his role as the man of the house with Jake's guidance, learning not just farming and ranching skills, but the character traits that would make him a leader in the community. Lucy blossomed under the attention of adults who genuinely cared about her welfare, while baby David thrived in an environment of love and security. Jake Sullivan, the giant cowboy who had spent 20 years drifting from town to town in search of redemption, finally found peace in the simple act of belonging to a family that needed him as much as he needed them. The Mitchell homestead became more than just the place where he lived. It became the home he had thought lost forever when fire took his original family 2 decades earlier. On a warm spring morning, as Jake taught Tommy how to repair the barn, they were rebuilding and Sarah worked in her garden while Lucy played with her younger brother. The giant cowboy realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from finding the courage to stop running and start building something lasting. The children who had approached him on that dusty street in Cedar Falls, desperate for help with their dying mother, had given him far more than he had given them. They had given him a second chance at the life he thought he had lost forever, and that gift was more precious than any treasure he could have imagined. As the sun climbed higher over the Colorado Valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jake Sullivan stood surrounded by the laughter of children and the quiet satisfaction of honest work. The giant cowboy had finally come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.